Before we dive into tonight's haunting story, be sure to like and subscribe, or you may find yourself wondering if something is watching you. Hit that button if you dare.
The hospice floor was quiet, save for the soft hum of medical equipment and the steady, rhythmic beeping of monitors. It was a place where time seemed to stretch and bend, where people went to say their final goodbyes, and yet there was something more than just death in the air. He was nearing the end of his battle with lung cancer, and though he had little family left, there was something calming about him. His days were spent mostly asleep, drifting in and out of consciousness. But there was always one thing that stood out: a small black feline with green eyes who would appear in the room at odd hours. We had seen many patients with their beloved pets curled up beside them in their final hours. But when I returned an hour later, Felix was gone. His cat was nowhere to be found either. I checked his records, but nothing about a cat was mentioned. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of the night shift playing tricks on me. But there was something unnerving about this cat. She didn't purr or nuzzle Felix, nor did she make any sound at all. There was a small group of hospice animals, cats, dogs, and even an old rabbit who seemed to show up just before a patient passed. It wasn't something we talked about openly, not at first. It was as though we were all afraid to acknowledge what was happening, but it became a pattern we couldn't ignore. She just stared. The silence between them was suffocating, like the air itself was holding its breath. She often asked about her old dog, a golden retriever named Max. Her family would visit every few days, but she never seemed to remember them. One evening, I was finishing my shift when I saw a small, scruffy dog sitting at the foot of her bed. His fur was matted, and he looked tired, as if he had been walking for days. Mrs. Langley smiled faintly when she saw him, her eyes softening. "Max," she whispered, reaching out a hand that trembled with age. The dog didn't move, but his presence in the room was undeniable. He was real, not a figment of her imagination. Felix never spoke about her. In fact, he rarely spoke at all. But every night, just as the light from the hallway dimmed, she would show up. As a nurse working the night shift, I had learned to listen to the silence, to sense the unseen shifts in the room when someone was nearing the end. The hall was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of the emergency exit sign. Felix's door was cracked open, and I saw her sleek, shadowy form slipping under the door with barely a sound. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. I had never seen her come in before, not in all my months of working here. I stepped quietly to the door, peeking in. Felix lay still in his bed, eyes closed, but there she was, perched at the foot of the bed, staring at him with unblinking eyes. But there was something else, a presence that couldn't be explained, an energy that hummed through the hallways, always just out of reach. It started when I met Felix, an elderly man with sharp blue eyes that betrayed a quiet intensity. I first noticed her one evening as I was finishing my rounds. It wasn't strange for animals to be allowed in hospice care. I didn't know what to think, so I stepped back, deciding to check in with Felix's nurse. But as the weeks passed, the visits from Felix's cat became more frequent, and she wasn't the only one. There was Mrs. Langley, an elderly woman in the final stages of Alzheimer's, who had been with us for weeks. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Just then, Mrs. Langley's daughter entered, and without a word, she looked at the dog, then at her mother, and simply nodded. As I continued my work at the hospice, I began to notice something even stranger. Some of the cats, the ones who had been regulars at our facility, seemed to know exactly when a patient was nearing the end. Oscar, a small tabby who had been a fixture at the hospice for years, would always show up unannounced, silently padding into the room of the dying. He didn't jump on the bed, didn't purr, didn't demand attention. "She's here," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Mabel's back." I looked around the room, but there was no cat, just the soft glow of the afternoon sun casting long shadows on the floor. Eleanor closed her eyes and sighed contentedly. "She's waiting for me." He just sat there at the foot of the bed, watching, waiting, and within hours, sometimes minutes, the patient would pass. Eleanor's breathing slowed, becoming more rhythmic, until there was a final, soft exhale. I'll never forget those moments to quiet arrivals of the animals. The way they seemed to be more than just pets. They were guides, companions, helping those who were ready to pass, find peace. And sometimes, when I walk down the hall, I swear I can still hear the soft padding of paws behind me, just out of sight, as if reminding me that no one ever truly dies alone. She was gone, her cat, Mabel, present in spirit, though never seen. It was a quiet passing, one that filled me with a strange sense of peace. I didn't know what to make of it, whether it was the cat spirit, the patient's memories, or something else entirely, but I knew one thing for sure. These animals had a way of bringing comfort when it was needed most. We didn't need to say anything. The dog stayed with her for the rest of the evening. It was as if these animals, these silent, unassuming companions, were guardians in their own right, ensuring that no one passed alone. It wasn't just the patients who noticed. Those moments, the ones where animals show up when needed, where death comes quietly, softly, like the last chapter of a long-lived story, are the ones that stay with you long after the beeping stops. And I know now, more than ever, that sometimes the best thing we can offer isn't just our knowledge, but our presence. And sometimes, that presence is shared with a quiet cat, waiting for the right time to say goodbye. Their families began to talk about the cats, the dogs, and even the rabbit. They too had seen the way the animals moved through the rooms, the way they seemed to comfort their loved ones, as though they understood something we didn't. And that night, Mrs. Langley passed quietly in her sleep, her hand resting on Max's fur. This wasn't just an isolated incident. At first it was hard to believe, but after seeing it happen several times, I couldn't ignore the pattern. And then there was the day I saw it for myself. Eleanor, a frail woman in her late 70s, had been in hospice care for weeks. Her health had declined rapidly, and her niece had been visiting daily, but Eleanor's condition wasn't improving. That afternoon, I stopped by her room to check on her. She was awake, her eyes wandering around the room, but not focusing on anything in particular. She asked about Mabel, her cat, but we had told her several times that Mabel had passed away years ago. I always let her have her moment, never correcting her. Some things were better left unsaid, but that day, as I sat beside her, Eleanor smiled. I stayed in the room for a while after that, just watching. Years have passed since those first visits from the hospice cats, and while I've seen many more patients come and go, in this line of work, we are taught to focus on the medical side of things, treatment, comfort, care, but there are moments that go beyond that, moments that can't be explained by science. The night shift at the hospice had always been the quietest, the soft, constant beeping of machines, the dull hum of fluorescent lights. But there was one patient I'll never forget, and it wasn't the man in room 1 or the woman in 202. It was the cat, and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor made the place feel frozen in time. Most of the patients were too far gone to notice, too lost in their pain or their comas to stir. There was something about her presence, something dark, that made the air grow heavier whenever she entered a room. I watched as midnight moved from room to room, her visits always coinciding with a patient's last breath. The staff started to notice too. We whispered about her in the break room, our voices low, as though speaking her name out loud would summon her, but none of us could deny the pattern whenever she was around. It wasn't just the patients she visited, it was their families too. It was a rainy evening, and the storm outside had left the hospice in complete darkness, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign. I was finishing up my rounds when I felt something strange, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I turned the corner toward room 307 and saw her, standing in the hallway, her back arched, her fur bristling. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on me. And this time, there was something different about her. She wasn't walking. She was frozen, staring, as though she was waiting for something. I remember one night, when an elderly man named Harold passed away. He had been surrounded by his family, his children, and grandchildren, all holding his hands, whispering their goodbyes. Midna had slipped into his room, just as they were saying their final words. She sat at the foot of the bed, watching them all, her eyes glinting in the dim light like she was sizing them up. And then, just as Harold's breathing stopped, she stood, her tail twitching, and disappeared into the shadows. But there was something unsettling about the silence, as if death itself was hovering just beyond the room, waiting. I had been working in hospice care for years, long enough to see countless patients pass, each leaving their mark on me in some way. She was a sleek, black cat with eyes like molten amber that seemed to glow in the darkness. She wasn't a regular patient's pet, she just appeared one night, slinking in from the shadows, her low growl vibrating through the hallway. I'd be making my rounds, checking on the patients, when I would catch a glimpse of her, her black fur blending with the darkness, her eyes glowing eerily. It was hard to tell where she came from. She would just appear, and she always seemed to be in the rooms where the patients were closest to passing. I didn't question it at first, but after seeing it happen several times, It started to make me uncomfortable. The cat would enter the room without a sound, slink to the foot of the bed, and curl up there, watching, unblinking. And then, without fail, within hours, the patient would pass. At first, I thought she was a stray, but she was far too sleek, too well fed for that. She made her rounds through the rooms, never bothering anyone. At first, it seemed like just another oddity, but the longer I worked the night shift, the more I noticed the unsettling pattern. It started in the dead of night. I told myself it was just coincidence, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Midnight was no ordinary cat. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. There was one night, though, when everything changed. I took a step forward, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run. Her eyes glowed like fire, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of her presence. It was as though the darkness had shifted, pulling me closer to her, wrapping me in its suffocating grip. Why is she looking at Mum like that? All I could do was watch as Midnight moved slowly, deliberately, toward the side of Mrs. Avery's bed. I could see her pupils dilating, her tail flicking, and then just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the shadows. We searched the halls, checked the rooms, but there was no sign of her. But I know this. Midnight's visits were not just about death. They were a reminder that sometimes the things we don't understand, the things that lurk in the shadows, can be the most terrifying of all. And maybe, just maybe, some of us are meant to go alone, with only the dark, watching eyes of a cat to guide us into the unknown. She had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared, and for weeks, we didn't see her again. But the memories of her dark eyes, her quiet, eerie presence, lingered. As I reached out, the cat suddenly sprinted past me, slipping into room 307 with lightning speed. Mrs. Avery had stopped breathing. The monitors showed no pulse, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Midnight had come for her. And somehow, in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just death that Midnight brought with it. It was a presence, a harbinger of something far darker, far more primal than we understood. My heart pounded in my ears as I followed her inside. Midnight was there, at the foot of the bed, her glowing eyes fixed on Mrs. Avery. The room felt colder, the air thick with tension. I took a step closer, but before I could say anything, Midnight let out a low, guttural growl, something I had never heard from her before. The growl was deep, vibrating through the walls, filling the room with a menacing energy. Honor's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. The room was dim, the machines quietly beeping in the background. Mrs. Avery, a frail woman in her late 80s, lay in the bed, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her daughter, Anna, sat beside her, holding her hand, tears running down her face. Anna didn't notice the cat at first, but I did. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to comfort her. I felt a chill in my spine as I turned to Anna, but her gaze was locked on her mother. The next morning, after Mrs. Avery's passing, Midnight was gone. I'm not sure if she was a spirit, a guardian, or something else entirely. The hospice was always quiet, too quiet. You could feel it in the stillness that settled like dust in the corners of the rooms. The heaviness in the air that only grew as the end of someone's life approached. As a nurse, you become attuned to the subtle signs, the small shifts in a person's energy that tell you death is near. He'd been with us for weeks, deteriorating slowly. His body was frail, his breathing labored, but his mind was still clear. Her body was half in shadow, half in the dim light from the hallway. His eyes were open, but he didn't seem to notice the cat. Patcha slowly padded into the room, her claws clicking softly on the floor. She jumped onto the bed, curling up at the foot, just as Mr. Ferris took one last, labored breath. His chest rose and fell with a final, strained effort, and then it stopped. There was no struggle, no dramatic last breath, just stillness. His eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling, and the room seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Patches didn't move. She simply sat there, watching, her eyes unwavering. Her eyes gleamed like twin pools of liquid gold. She didn't make a sound, didn't even move, but the air felt colder, heavier, as if the room had shifted somehow. We all knew he didn't have long, but he was a fighter. That night, after the staff had gone off shift, I stayed behind to check on him one last time. The hall was empty. The only sound, the occasional creak of the building settling. But there was something else, something darker, that I couldn't explain, something that lingered just outside the rooms, just out of sight. It wasn't the machines or the medications that signaled when someone was close to passing. It was her, the cat. Her name was Patches, a calico with a coat that looked like it had been painted with uneven strokes of white, orange, and black. She wasn't anyone's pet, or so I thought. She just appeared one evening, slinking into the hospice as though she had been there all along. She wasn't an ordinary cat. There was something unnerving about her, a stillness that settled around her like a dark fog. The staff tried to shoo her away, but she always returned. No one could figure out where she came from or why she stayed, but in the weeks that followed, I began to see a pattern that chilled me to my core. It started with the elderly Mr. Ferris. He was a grizzled old man, sharp-tongued and stubborn, with no family left. I was heading toward Mr. Ferris's room when I saw her. She was sitting at the end of the hallway, her glowing eyes fixed on the door to his room. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared, her fur stiff, as if she were waiting. I could feel a knot form in my chest, a tightness I couldn't explain. I had seen her before, but I never thought much of it. Now though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I continued down the hallway, trying to ignore the growing unease. But as I opened Mr. Ferris's door, I saw her again this time. Standing in the doorway, Mr. Ferris lay in his bed, his breathing shallow. I called the family, though I knew there was nothing to be done. Mr. Ferris had passed quietly. She appeared at the foot of patients' beds, watching, always silent, always still. Each time she appeared, I felt a shiver run down my spine, as though her presence heralded something terrible. It wasn't just the patients she visited, it was their families too. I remember one night, a woman named Carol, who had been sitting vigil by her father's side, asked me about the cat. I took another step back, and that's when it happened. Is she ... always here? She asked, her voice trembling. I could feel something, an energy, a presence move through the room. And then, in the blink of an eye, Mrs. Harper gasped, her body jerking upright in bed. All I could do was watch as Mrs. Harper's body convulsed, her hands flailing, and then just as quickly as it had begun, her breathing stopped, her eyes frozen open, locked in an unseeing stare. Her eyes snapped open, wide and unblinking, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Patches sat calmly at the foot of the bed, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Harper's body. But the darkness, the feeling of something watching, never left. I still remember the coldness of her gaze, the weight of her presence. Some say animals sense death before we do, but I don't believe that. No, Patches wasn't just sensing death, she was bringing it. And in the silence of the hospice hall, with only the flickering lights and the soft hum of machines to accompany her, I couldn't shake the feeling that death itself had come in the form of a cat. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if she was waiting for something, as if the room had been filled with some kind of dark energy that I couldn't explain. I turned and fled the room, my heart racing in my chest, but the image of Mrs. Harper's open eyes and the stillness of the cat haunted me for the rest of the night. I swear I've seen her by my dad's bed a few times. I wasn't sure what it was, but I couldn't help feeling that the cat had something to do with it. Something dark, something that had been lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. Over the next few weeks, Patches' presence grew more frequent. I nodded, though I didn't know how to explain it. She just shows up sometimes, I said. She's harmless, don't worry about her. But I wasn't sure if I was reassuring her or myself. I couldn't bring myself to admit that I was scared of the cat, that I had begun to believe she wasn't just a stray, but something else entirely. The final straw came one rainy night when I was working alone. The storm outside battered against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks in the building. It was a long shift, and I had just finished checking on the last few patients when I heard the unmistakable sound of Patches' claws clicking on the floor. I turned, but she wasn't in the hallway this time. She was standing in the doorway of room 211, staring at me with those cold, glowing eyes. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. The room was dark, but the monitors were still beeping steadily. Inside, I saw the patient, Mrs. Harper, lying motionless in bed. She had been unresponsive for hours. Her daughter had just left for the night, exhausted from the long days of sitting by her mother's side. I knew Mrs. Harper wasn't long for this world, but as I approached the bed, I felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over me, a sharp sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I turned to leave, but Patches was already in the room, her tail flicking slowly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Harper. The air grew colder. The lights flickered, and the room felt like it was closing in around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I stood in the doorway, my legs trembling. I never saw Patches again after that night. She disappeared as mysteriously as she had come. I had been working at the hospice for over 10 years, long enough to see every kind of passing, some peaceful, some violent, and some that left a strange chill in the room. But there was one patient that haunts me to this day, not because of the nature of her death, but because of the eerie presence that seemed to linger long after she was gone. The floor was quiet, the hallways dimly lit by the low, flickering light overhead. I was approaching room 302 when I saw her midnight standing in the doorway, her glowing eyes fixed on me. I froze for a moment, taken aback by how still she was, how unnerving her gaze felt. She would show up unannounced, slip into rooms where patients were clearly at death's door, and curl up at the foot of the bed, watching over them silently. The patients were too far gone to notice, but the families, sometimes they would see her too. I remember one evening, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman with advanced Alzheimer's, asked me if I had seen her cat. I had been a nurse long enough to understand the quiet rhythm of dying, but this it was different. It was like Midnight knew something we didn't, something the patients themselves knew deep down. She was speaking to no one in particular, just murmuring to herself, "Where's Midnight?" she said, looking at the empty corner of the room where the cat had been just moments before. "She's always here. She's always with me." I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just an animal, but the unsettling feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Midnight was there, watching, somewhere, just out of sight. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson passed away quietly in her sleep, her family at her side, but Midnight was gone by then, as though she had never been there at all. It all started with the cat. We started to notice a pattern, though we never spoke about it openly, not even among the staff. Midnight would appear in the room of a patient, sit at the foot of their bed, and within hours, sometimes minutes, they would pass. It wasn't always the same time of day, and it wasn't always a particular room, but whenever Midnight was there, death wasn't far behind. We called her Midnight, a sleek, black cat with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the light around her. She wasn't anyone's pet. She didn't belong to any of the patients, and no one ever saw her come or go. She just appeared one night, slipping silently down the hallway with nothing but the faintest sound of her paws against the floor. He had been unconscious for days, barely breathing. I checked his vitals, then stepped back to give him some space. That's when I noticed her again. Midnight was at the foot of his bed, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't seem to want anything, didn't make a sound. She just sat there, as though waiting. At first I thought she was just a stray that had wandered in, but that assumption quickly changed. I remember the first time I saw her. It was late, and I was on my usual rounds, checking in on patients, making sure everyone was comfortable. Midnight didn't move as I walked past her, and when I entered room 302, I found Mr. Barnes, a frail old man in the final stages of cancer, lying in bed. I didn't think much of it at first, though I did notice the eerie quiet that settled in when she was around. Something about her presence changed the atmosphere in the room. It was as if the air became heavier, colder, more oppressive. I didn't know why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread when she was there. Over the next few days, Midnight appeared again and again. I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't seen a cat in her room, but things began to get stranger. The visits from Midnight became more frequent, and always just before someone was about to die. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then came Sarah. Sarah was young only, 35, and had been in hospice for just a few days. She had suffered from a long, painful battle with terminal cancer, and by the time she arrived at the hospice, there was nothing more we could do. She was so weak that she could barely lift her head off the pillow, but there was something about her spirit that still fought, still clung to life with everything she had. I found her one night when I was doing my rounds, sitting up in bed, looking out the window. It was a stormy night, the rain hammering against the windows, and the low rumble of thunder added an eerie atmosphere to the room. When I walked in, she looked at me with a faint smile. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. But I know that Midnight wasn't just a cat. She was something else, something ancient, something that knew the way between life and death, and she showed up when we needed her most. Even now, when I walk the halls of that hospice, I feel her presence in the corners of my mind, a reminder that death isn't always a dramatic, chaotic thing. Sometimes it's quiet, still, and guided by a shadowed cat who knows just when to leave. I wasn't sure what she meant, but I nodded, adjusting the blankets around her, because I know, even in the quietest moments, no one ever really dies alone. She didn't seem afraid. In fact, she almost seemed comforted by Midnight's presence. And then, just as I turned to leave, I saw her midnight slinking through the door like a shadow. She had passed quietly in her sleep, her hand resting lightly on Midnight's fur. We checked the grounds, the shelters, even put up. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air, as mysteriously as she had come. But I know she was there, that night, with Sarah, and I'll never forget the feeling of her eyes watching over us all. It wasn't like the other deaths I had witnessed. This one felt ... different. It was as though Midnight had been there, not just to comfort Sarah, but to guide her through the final moments, to offer a silent, unseen presence in the darkness. There was a strange stillness in the room, a peace that I hadn't seen in Sarah before. It was as if she had finally let go, as if Midnight had given her permission to surrender. Her eyes locked onto Sarah, and for the first time, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Sarah, too, saw the cat. Her eyes widened, and she reached out a hand toward her. "It's time," Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with a sense of calm acceptance. I stayed in the doorway, watching, as Midnight jumped onto the bed and curled up beside Sarah, just like she had done for the others. When I checked on her a few hours later, Sarah was gone. The next morning, I searched the building for Midnight, but she was gone. She never came back, not after Sarah. Some say animals have a special connection to death, that they can sense when it's near. I'm not sure if that's true. And when I hear the faint sound of paws padding softly down the hallway, I can't help but feel a sense of comfort. I've worked in hospice care for years, long enough to witness the way death crept into the lives of the people who came through our doors. It wasn't always a loud or dramatic event, but sometimes, in the silence of a patient's final hours, something else would fill the air, something that couldn't be explained. That something was a cat. She never rubbed against anyone's legs, never meowed at the nurses or the patients. She simply appeared always in the rooms of those who were nearing the end of their journey. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was subtle, but over time, we started to notice the pattern. There was something strange about her presence, something that felt... It was peaceful, they said. No pain, no struggle, just a quiet passing in the night, ancient, timeless, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Every time Willow showed up in a room, it was followed by a death. Not immediately, but always within a few hours. She seemed to know, to sense the exact moment when someone was ready to let go. It was as if she had some kind of sixth sense, some ability to guide the souls of the dying. I shook off the feeling and checked Mr. Avery's vitals, but the unease remained in the pit of my stomach. Willow would show up uninvited, as if summoned by an unseen force, and sit at the foot of a patient's bed. She was one of the last of the patients I had grown close to, a woman who had told me stories of her childhood and her late husband. She was surrounded by family during the day, but at night, when everyone left, she was alone. One evening, I stayed late to keep her company. As the night grew darker, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and a feeling of quiet dread settled over the room. She didn't do anything, didn't interact with the patients, didn't show any particular interest in the people who filled the room. She simply sat, staring at the person lying there, as if she was waiting for something. It was as if she were more than just a cat. She was a guide, a spirit, something between life and death. Her name was Willow, a small tabby, with fur as soft as old velvet, and eyes that seemed to shimmer with a strange kind of wisdom. She didn't belong to anyone. She wasn't a patient's pet, and she wasn't a stray. She was perched at the foot of his bed, watching him with those golden eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light of the room. I felt a pang of unease, an instinctual fear that crawled up my spine. But I told myself it was just a cat. I had seen countless animals visit patients before. They often brought a sense of comfort, even in the hardest of times. She simply appeared one evening, slipping quietly into the building, as though she had always been a part of the place. At first, we thought nothing of it. His wife had passed away years earlier, and his children lived too far away to visit regularly. He was alone in the world, his life reduced to the quiet routine of hospice care. His condition had been worsening, but he still clung to life with surprising resilience. A stray cat wandering in from the storm. But Willow wasn't like any cat I had ever known. She didn't seek attention. The first time I noticed it was with Mr. Avery, a man in his mid-70s who had been battling cancer for months. One evening, as I made my rounds, I saw Willow in his room. But Willow wasn't like the other animals. She was different. That night, as I returned to my station, I got the call. Mr. Avery had passed away in his sleep. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as the days went on, the pattern started to form. There was something unsettling about it, the way she moved through the halls, slipping silently between patients' rooms, always just out of sight when you needed her. Then there was Mrs. Holloway, a woman in her 80s, frail and weakened by years of heart disease.
I was sitting at the foot of her bed, reading the newspaper, when I felt it, that strange familiar chill in the air. I looked up, and there she was, Willow, sitting at the foot of the bed, her eyes glowing in the dim light. I couldn't explain it. How could I? Willow didn't make a sound, it moved. The room seemed to hold its breath, and the silence felt thick, heavy, as if the world had frozen in time. I called her family, but I already knew she had passed away in her sleep, just as Willow had predicted. She just stared at Mrs. Holloway, her golden eyes fixed on the woman who had spent her last days talking about the man she had lost. Mrs. Holloway didn't notice at first, too weak to lift her head, but I saw her, watching, waiting, just a quiet man waiting for the inevitable. I had always found him to be a bit distant, never speaking much, his mind fading in and out of consciousness. But tonight, something was different. His eyes were open. His breathing was slow but steady. He looked at Willow, and for the first time in days, I saw him smile. I didn't say anything. She jumped up onto the covers, curling up at his feet, her eyes never leaving his. I stood at the door, watching. There was something so serene about that moment. It felt as though time had stopped, as though the whole world had quieted to listen. The night dragged on, and around 2 a.m., I heard him. Mrs. Holloway took one last shallow breath, then stopped. His hand was still outstretched, as though he had been reaching for something, and Willow was no longer there. We all started to notice the same thing. When Willow appeared, death was imminent. But it wasn't the usual kind of death. Maybe she was a spirit. Maybe just an animal who somehow understood the fragility of life. But what I do know is this. When she showed up, the air changed. The room grew still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And when she left, it was as if she had taken the final breath with her, leaving only silence in her wake. No one saw her again, and the hospice felt quieter somehow, emptier. I searched for her, of course, asked around, but it was as if she had never been there. Yet, in my heart, I knew better. She had been more than just a cat. She had been something else entirely, an observer, a guide, a presence. She was the final touch, the one who helped the souls of the dying find peace. It was late, and I was finishing up my rounds when I heard a noise in room 404. I opened the door cautiously, and there she was, Willow, sitting on the windowsill, staring out at the storm. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled, but the room felt eerily still. It wasn't the kind we were used to, where someone fades away slowly, surrounded by a family, comforted in their last hour. No, Willow's presence brought something else. It brought the finality of it, the certainty. She was a witness, a guide, leading them toward the inevitable. I didn't stay in the room for long. As I left, I looked back at the bed where Willow remained. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, watching, waiting. Her gaze followed me as I closed the door behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow keeping watch over the souls of those who were passing through. Days turned into weeks, and the staff began to talk. They came tonight that made me question everything. On the bed lay Mr. Daniels, a man in his 90s who had been in hospice for nearly a month. He had no family left, no friends. He reached out a hand toward her, and Willow responded, moving silently from the windowsill to the foot of the bed. A few hours later, I returned to check on him, and he was gone. Just like that! No struggle, no pain! After that night, Willow never returned. She disappeared as mysteriously as she had come. To this day, I still don't fully understand what Willow was. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, you won't forget to share this video with Them stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest staleys are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video if you dare.